Both Priya Patel and Kash Patel have used the fact that their families were kicked out of Uganda by Idi Amin as a badge of honor and of victimization. Now, what's wrong with that narrative? Well, I'm no fan of Idi Amin. He was a ruthless dictator, and I certainly don't think that anyone should be deported due to their race. However, some of his accusations were actually true. Ugandan Asians were in league with the British before independence.
This creator made a really informative video clearing up some of the misconceptions around the period of history in Uganda when people of Indian descent had to flee. And the gist of it is that, yes, Idi Amin was a brutal dictator and an ethnic group was singled out. And it's not that those who had to flee didn't suffer the trauma of persecution and dislocation, but also that Amin rose to power in a context that we should examine if we actually care about making sure these things don't happen again. And Indians in Uganda were not and are not a monolith, but the relationship that some elements of the Indian population had with Uganda made me think about merchant classes and the myth of innocence within which they wrap themselves, to deflect from the exploitative and extractive relationship that they have with the societies within which they live, which they may or may not be indigenous to. And this myth allows them to label any pushback against their sometimes shady business practices as envy. I feel like V.S. Naipaul no doubt had Uganda and maybe any number of other African countries in mind when he wrote A Bend in the River. And though Naipaul was perhaps, as he tended to be, problematically ambivalent about the role of the merchant class in the society portrayed in the novel, it's very clear that their practices were far from ethical and they were not at all rooted in the society within which they operated and had even lived for generations. A Bend in the River was perhaps one of the most tedious books I've ever read. And it's not because Naipaul was incapable of maintaining an engaging narrative, but I feel like he did a good job of portraying this kind of listlessness that can permeate groups that are not really rooted in anything. So, of course, all of this made me think about Indians in Trinidad and Tobago, where I am from, and whether we constitute what might be called a merchant class. So I think in Trinidad and Tobago, as in Uganda, there's a lot of diversity within the local Indian population. And though some of us aspire to and perhaps reach the merchant class, many of us are or were impoverished. So, for example, many of the people that I grew up with didn't exactly make it. Some of them went to jail. Some of them are in very vulnerable situations. There are forces in Trinidad and Tobago which are invested in making us think the great divide is between races. I think that's so that we never think too much about class and how it affects the possibilities of our life. But there's another divide even within our ethnic group, and that has to do with culture and how rooted we are in the space. Culturally, some Indo-Chinese are only Trinbagonian or Caribbean on paper, and their identities are a bit murky, perhaps tied to a local social scene that they inhabit together with those of similar class. Or their identities might be more tied to this kind of invented sense of Indianness, which traces back only to the establishment of the nation state of India, which coincides with the approximate time that we got access to media in Trinidad and Tobago, so that we could see films and TV shows and things like that, which came from India. And we kind of got the sense that that's what it meant to be Indian. And increasingly, I think a lot of people's identities are tied to this kind of global cosmopolitanism, an identity which kind of avoids the issues of class and race. This might have been my fate were it not for two things. One is the economic precarity of the first 18 years of my life and the solidarity that I learned from having to survive it. And the second thing that has really shaped my identity was my grounding in authentic grassroots Trimbegonian culture and Indo-Trini culture, which is its own thing. And also my relationship that I cultivated with the land. And I think there are many Indo-Trinis who are like me, who are first and foremost Trimbegonians, though we may have our own subculture. But all of that is just layers. And it fills you up in a world where there are great profits to be made from empty people who buy things to try to fill the void. So I think there are many of us who are unlike the merchants in Naipaul's novel, who don't really belong anywhere or believe in anything much other than profits and the accumulation of wealth, and have no problem simply extracting from the place where they reside and never giving anything back. And the reason why I even care about discussing these aspects of identity is that it clearly affects our politics and our investment in doing things to help us to progress as a people, as a nation, as a society.